Hello everyone, Lucy here today, and I am here to talk to you a little bit about one of the things that people often critique about people with DID. It's something that people seem to think that someone can't have DID unless they experience it in the way that they are used to. And that is trauma. It's something that when you hear that word you will think automatically about a certain way of experiencing trauma, but it's actually a lot broader topic than you might think at first thought. And yes, to have DID, it is a trauma response. So somebody does have to have experienced trauma in order to have DID. But as we'll talk about, there's no way of you knowing if somebody's trauma is good enough for them to have DID. Again, it's another way people try and say that you're a faker. But again, we've been over this. You can't call somebody a faker unless you are that person. So let's just crack on. So trauma. What makes trauma trauma? What makes your trauma, trauma-y enough to have DID? So basically, trauma can be different for all different people. There are some broad categories that I'll quickly run through of types of trauma, but all different kinds of things can fit into those categories, and those categories are very broad. So some of the categories include physical abuse, emotional abuse. That can be a whole number of different things that you might not necessarily consider abuse when you first think of them, but are. So being manipulative, being controlling, being all different kinds of things, experiences, bullying, being shouted at a lot as a child, all of these kind of things. Sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, so that kind of speaks for itself. But it's sort of, again, about your emotional needs not being met, potentially, as a child. Mental ill health, or your caregivers or parents or those around you having ill health, that could affect the child. Substance misuse, again, usually by the caregivers. Criminality, disappearing of a caregiver figure, or the situations and things that come with that lifestyle. Domestic violence, and that can be verbal violence as well, which ties in a little bit with the emotional abuse, and separation, so being taken away from caregivers for divorce, if that's not handled particularly well. As we discuss in a moment, all of these things are very nuanced. So things like living in care, criminally exploited, gang membership, bereavement, critical illness, being a young carer, prejudice or immigration, are all other types of trauma. But what we'll quickly go into is that with all of these, I'm pretty sure most people will hear that list and think, yep, that makes sense, that sounds like a type of trauma, you can get your head around that. But those are just broad topics of what could constitute trauma. The main thing to consider when it comes to trauma is the window of tolerance. And that is, there's a certain amount of stress and issues, I suppose, a child can deal with before it becomes toxic stress, which is where it's too much for somebody, a young person or child, and it continues for a long time. So different people have different windows of tolerance. Somebody could deal with a very severe trauma, any number of the ones that we've gone through, and be able to deal with it, process it, and be shown how to cope, and then not have severe after effects. So they might be able to cope with that trauma. Or the same instance, the same situation given to somebody else with a different window of tolerance, and they might not be able to cope at all, and then they might develop PTSD or a coping mechanism such as dissociative identity disorder. I hope I'm making this clear. In the same vein, there might be a traumatic, stressful event that to some person seems like nothing. It doesn't seem like an issue. It seems like something completely able to be coped with, but somebody else might be more sensitive to it. Somebody else might have a different window of tolerance. And then that means that that stress will continue and stay for a long time and cause this trauma to stay as a trauma, to become a trauma, and to develop coping mechanisms again like DID. So with any of these traumatic events, the big key thing is how the person, the child or young person, is able to deal with that event. Things that help a lot is being soothed, so being shown how to regulate those feelings or how to handle that stress, being shown that things are okay quickly, being helped to process what's happening will help and make it less likely that the traumatic event will turn into a trauma for that person. It's if there's overwhelming stress that the child or young person is unable to cope with or deal with, that is when something becomes a trauma. So a traumatic event will turn into a trauma if you are unable to process and cope with it. And that varies from person to person. It's not a mental health thing, it's just some children and young people are able to cope with things in different ways and at different levels. It's about how you felt about that traumatic event afterwards. Again, somebody could have a car accident and be able to work through those feelings and afterwards get back in a car, drive, go on road trips. Somebody else might be in that same car accident, in the same car, but not be able to deal with it afterwards, not have the same help with soothing and being able to cope, and it becomes a trauma for them, and they can never get in a car and they really struggle with it and develop PTSD for it. So that's the really big, strong thing to reiterate here. The other key point that I want to put in here in terms of DID and how people tell others that they're faking is amnesia. So DID is a defensive, protective disorder to try and protect you from the trauma that you experienced. So although you have to have trauma to have DID, one, it might not be perceived as trauma to everybody because they might have been able to deal with it fine, but you were not. And two, you might not know what that trauma is because you don't remember it, because DID is helping you to not remember. So, for example, we do not know of a trauma, you know, that we can pinpoint and say, that was it. That was the trauma that caused our DID. That could be because we still have a lot of amnesia to work through as a system. It could be that we have a trauma holder and we don't even know it yet. All of these are possibilities that can happen in a DID system. Somebody could say, I have DID and I don't have any trauma, because they don't know that they have any trauma. They do not remember it. They do not, you know, get flashbacks to it, because their DID is working. DID doesn't want you to know about these traumatic events. It's there to protect you. So that's another thing. Someone could well say, I don't have trauma, and they do still have DID because they might not remember it. Or one of their alters might remember it, but the, you know, main person who fronts might not. Again, we're really lucky that we have pretty good communication as a system, and that we don't believe that we know of anybody in our system who's holding on to this, but we don't know. And that's the thing with DID. There's a lot of things that, one, haven't been researched enough, that we don't know about, and two, there's a lot that can be hidden and kept private from even its own system. So bear that in mind if you ever see somebody talking about their DID, that their trauma might not look like trauma to you, because everybody's window of tolerance is different, and that they might not remember their trauma. So that's something to think about with DID. It's a trauma-based condition, but it's complicated that you might not know what that trauma is, or it might not seem like that much of a big deal. So yeah, that's one of the other things that a lot of people like to say. You don't have DID because you don't have trauma. I hope I've explained why that's a bit of a silly thing to say to somebody who says they have DID. Again, unless you are that person, you don't know if somebody's got a mental health disorder or not. I'm sorry we keep going on about that, but obviously it's something that affects us quite a lot. So thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a really awesome day. It's been really sunny for us. We've been enjoying the sun and the warmth. I've been experimenting with makeup, and yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I really hope you have an awesome day, and we will see you soon. Bye!